You ever walk into one of those family gatherings where the air feels thicker than the gravy on Thanksgiving turkey, everyone smiling through gritted teeth while old grudges simmer just below the surface like forgotten pots on the stove? And that's exactly how I felt pulling up to my parents' backyard in Elmwood Park that warm summer evening, the kind of night where crickets start their chorus early and the scent of charcoal briquettes mixes with the faint tang of cut grass, my brother David's engagement party in full swing, and me, Sarah Thompson, 42 years old and fresh off a grueling week at the marketing agency, trying to paste on a grin despite Mom's sharp words from earlier that day when she called to remind me of the rules for the night. "Keep your news to yourself, Sarah. This is his moment," she'd said over the phone, her voice laced with that familiar edge of favoritism that had colored our lives since David was born 3 years before me, the golden child who could charm his way out of any mess while I, the steady older sister, always ended up cleaning it up without so much as a pat on the back, so I agreed like I always did, swallowing the lump in my throat because fighting Mom was about as productive as yelling at the rain during a Chicago downpour. I'd been bursting with my own updates for weeks now, the senior promotion that finally bumped my salary into territory where I could think about trading my cramped apartment for something with actual sunlight, and then there was Mark, the quiet architect I'd met at a coffee shop near the office, the one who laughed at my dry jokes about client meetings gone wrong and actually stuck around for second dates without an excuse about work piling up. But no, tonight belonged to David and his fiancée, Lisa, that warm-hearted elementary school teacher from Springfield with curly auburn hair and a way of making everyone feel seen, even if it meant overlooking the family dynamics that twisted my gut every time we gathered. The driveway was packed with cars from aunts, uncles, and cousins who'd driven in from as far as Rockford, their bumpers dusted with the pollen from rural fields, and as I stepped out in my simple blue sundress, the one that hid the extra pounds from too many late-night stress eats, I could already hear the laughter spilling over the fence, a sound that promised joy but always carried an undercurrent of comparison. Like how David's life seemed to unfold in neat chapters while mine felt more like a choose-your-own-adventure with too many dead ends. Mom met me at the gate, her apron still tied around her waist from helping Dad with the grill, and she pulled me into a quick hug that felt more obligatory than heartfelt, whispering again about keeping quiet before bustling off to refill the punch bowl, leaving me to weave through the crowd on my own, nodding at Uncle Ray, who was already 3 beers in, and regaling a group of teenagers with tales of his glory days as a union welder down at the steel mill, his voice booming over the sizzle of burgers flipping on the grate. I grabbed a plastic cup of the fruity punch, non-alcoholic, of course, because Mom didn't trust anyone to hold their liquor around the kids, and scanned the yard, spotting David at the center of it all, his broad shoulders filling out a crisp polo shirt, arms slung casually around Lisa as they chatted with neighbors from the block, the diamond on her finger catching the late afternoon sun like a tiny beacon of the future they were building, one that everyone seemed to envy without question, while I hovered on the edges, exchanging small talk with Aunt Karen about her latest obsession with those ceramic garden gnomes that lined her front porch back in Naperville. The conversation drifting to how the neighborhood had changed since we were kids racing bikes down these same streets, but inside my head, the resentment bubbled quietly, wondering why my hard-won battles at the office or the tentative spark with Mark couldn't get even a footnote in the family newsletter. As the sun began its slow dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of orange and pink that reminded me of those high school sunsets I'd watch from the bleachers after cheer practice, Mom clinked her glass with a spoon to gather everyone around the picnic tables laden with potato salad, coleslaw, and ears of corn still steaming from the pot, and David stood first, his toast smooth and practiced like the salesman he was, thanking the family for their support through the years, his eyes misty as he pulled Lisa closer, the crowd ing in that collective way that made my chest tighten because it highlighted just how seamlessly he fit into this picture of American dream domesticity, the kind sold in those glossy magazines at the grocery checkout. I raised my glass along with the rest, forcing enthusiasm into my smile, but then Lisa caught my eye from across the table, waving me over with a genuine curiosity. That cut through the noise, and when I sidled up, she leaned in and asked about my work at the agency, her interest real enough to tempt me into almost spilling the promotion details right there. The way it would mean leading my own team on campaigns for local brands like that craft brewery in Wrigleyville, but Mom's warning flashed like a stop sign. So I pivoted to a safer story about a recent client pitch that involved wrangling a room full of executives over bad coffee, chuckling at the memory to keep things light. That's when the opportunity for a small payback presented itself, subtle enough to fly under the radar, but pointed enough to scratch the itch of years of being second fiddle, because David had been lording his sales victories over everyone lately. So I murmured to Lisa just loud enough for a couple of nearby cousins to overhear, he sealed that big deal last year by promising a client those Prime Bears tickets he never actually scored, ended up crashing on my couch for a full week while he scrambled to fix it, turning my living room into a war zone of takeout boxes and stress rants, and she let out a soft laugh, her eyes twinkling with amusement, but there was a subtle shift in her expression. Like she tucked that nugget away for later reflection, a tiny crack in the pedestal David stood on that gave me a fleeting sense of balance restored. The evening progressed with the easy rhythm of these events, stories flowing like the beer from the cooler, Dad firing up anecdotes about David's Little League triumphs when he'd strike out the side in the championship game back in the 80s. Everyone nodding along as if those moments defined him still, while I picked at the edge of my burger bun, my mind wandering to the what-ifs of my own path, the divorce 5 years ago from Tom who couldn't commit to anything beyond fantasy football. Sundays, leaving me to rebuild alone in a city that chewed up dreams and spat them out. Laughter swelled again as the toast circled back, David's voice carrying that polished charm that closed deals and won hearts. But just as the group leaned in for the final cheers, Lisa rose slowly from her seat, smoothing the fabric of her sundress with hands that betrayed a slight tremble. The backyard falling into a profound hush where even the crickets seemed to pause, and she said clearly, her voice steady yet weighted with unspoken layers, "Before we toast, there's something about him you should all hear." The words landing like a stone in still water, rippling silence through the assembly as forks hovered forgotten over plates, eyes widening in a collective freeze. My heart slamming against my ribs because whatever came next promised to shatter the fragile peace we'd all pretended to hold, leaving me suspended in that electric moment, breath caught, utterly captivated by the unknown unfolding right there in the heart of our fractured family circle. That heavy silence wrapped around the backyard like a fog rolling off Lake Michigan on a chilly morning, every pair of eyes fixed on Lisa as she stood there with the fading sunlight glinting off her engagement ring. Her posture straight, but her fingers twisting the napkin in her lap in a way that betrayed the nerves bubbling beneath her composed exterior, and I could feel the collective breath of the family held tight, waiting for her to elaborate on that cryptic statement about something we all needed to hear regarding David, my brother who had always navigated life with the kind of effortless grace that left the rest of us scrambling to keep up. His salesman's smile now frozen in place, as if he'd rehearsed this moment in some corporate training video on handling curveballs. She paused for what felt like an eternity, the crickets resuming their chirp as if to fill the void, and then her voice softened, carrying across the tables with a warmth that eased the tension just enough to prevent outright panic, explaining how David had been her unwavering support not only in their budding relationship, but also in quietly helping out other family members during tough times. Specifically recounting the way he'd driven Aunt Karen to her chemotherapy sessions last year after her breast cancer diagnosis without ever seeking credit or sympathy, wiring her money from his own savings to cover the copays that insurance wouldn't touch, and even sitting through her endless rants about hospital food that tasted like cardboard, a gesture that painted him once again as the selfless hero of our clan, drawing nods and misty-eyed smiles from the aunts while Mom dabbed at her cheeks with the corner of her apron, her pride swelling visibly as if this revelation cemented David's place in the pantheon of perfect sons. Relieved laughter bubbled up from the group, glasses clinking in premature toasts that shattered the quiet like ice cracking underfoot, and I joined in the applause my own clap a bit too sharp because even in this moment of his elevation, the old familiar sting of being overlooked twisted in my chest, reminding me of all the times I'd been the one holding things together behind the scenes without fanfare. Like when I'd taken unpaid leave to care for Dad after his heart scare 3 years back, managing his medications and doctor's appointments while David sent postcards from his latest conference in Vegas. But of course, no one ever pulled me aside to sing my praises at family dinners. As the party surged back to life with plates of dessert being passed around, apple pie still warm from the oven, topped with scoops of vanilla ice cream that began to melt in the humid air, I slipped away from the main cluster toward the far edge of the yard where the chain-link fence met the neighbors' overgrown lilac bushes, their blooms heavy and fragrant in the twilight, allowing myself a moment to breathe and process the near miss of whatever bomb Lisa might have actually dropped, my mind replaying Mom's earlier directive over the phone that afternoon when she'd called from the kitchen amid the clatter of pots as she prepped for the grill, her tone brooking no argument as she emphasized that my recent successes had to stay under wraps to avoid stealing the spotlight from David's big night, a pattern as old as our childhood in that modest ranch house on Elm Street where David, with his tousled blonde hair and quick wit, commanded attention from the cradle, charming teachers into extra recess time while I, the serious one with my nose in books about marketing trends even back in junior high, got praised for effort, but never the effortless shine he possessed. Growing up in those post-industrial suburbs of Chicago, where factory whistles marked the rhythm of our days and summer evenings meant fireflies in mason jars on the back porch, David had always been the orbit's center, scoring the lead in the school play without auditioning twice, landing scholarships that whisked him to Northwestern while I pieced together community college credits around part-time jobs at the local mall, selling perfumes to harried moms who reminded me of my own future, and by our 30s, he'd parlayed that charisma into a mid-level sales gig at a pharmaceutical firm, complete with expense account lunches and a company car. Whereas I'd clawed my way through agency internships and late nights pitching ad campaigns for everything from car dealerships to craft fairs, ending up divorced at 37 from a husband whose idea of commitment was renewing his golf club membership, leaving me to rebuild in a one-bedroom overlooking the Kennedy Expressway with its endless honk of rush-hour traffic. Now here was Lisa, fitting into his narrative like the missing puzzle piece, her background as a teacher in a small-town school district speaking to that wholesome Midwestern stability everyone in our family secretly craved, and as I watched her circulate among the cousins with her easy laugh that cut through the chatter like a summer breeze, I felt a pang of something not quite envy but close, a what-if curiosity about how my life might have unfolded if I'd caught a break like his. Perhaps with Mark's steady presence turning into something more permanent instead of the cautious steps we were taking over shared hikes in the Indiana dunes or quiet dinners at Hole-in-the-Wall Ticarius, where we swapped stories about exes without the bitterness creeping in too deep. The fire pit crackled to life as dusk fully settled, casting flickering shadows that danced across faces softened by the glow, and the group gathered closer with bags of marshmallows skewered on coat hangers from the garage, the sweet char of roasting treats mingling with the lingering smoke from the grill, turning the evening into one of those nostalgic vignettes that could almost make you forget the undercurrents if you tried hard enough, but my own news threatened to bubble over. When Uncle Ray, his face ruddy from the cooler and animated gestures, lumbered over during a lull in the S-More assembly and clapped me on the shoulder with enough force to slosh my fresh cup of punch, bellowing loud enough for half the yard to hear about the rumor he'd picked up from a mutual friend at the auto parts store where he still tinkered on weekends. Something along the lines of my landing that senior role at the agency with its promise of leading creative teams on national accounts. His enthusiasm pulling heads around like a magnet and forcing me to improvise on the spot with vague mentions of collaborative projects and team milestones, all while Mom's glare from across the flames burned hotter than the embers. Her silent command clear as day to zip it before I derailed the harmony she so meticulously curated. David grinned over the rim of his beer bottle, seemingly oblivious to the friction, but offering a thumbs-up that felt patronizing in its simplicity, while Lisa tilted her head with that perceptive glint in her eye, as if she could sense the layers of history pressing down on me like the weight of an old quilt from Grandma's attic, heavy with memories but threadbare in places. And in that moment, as the conversation shifted back to wedding registry suggestions for kitchen gadgets that Lisa swore she'd use every day, I saw my opening for a touch of revenge, the kind that was light on its feet but carried a pointed edge honed from years of watching him bask unchallenged. So during the group photo set up by the rose trellis, where Dad's hybrid teas bloomed in defiant pinks and reds, I leaned into a cluster of relatives, including cousin Mike, who worked construction down in Joliet and had always ribbed David about his soft office life, murmuring just audibly about that infamous incident from our teens when David had borrowed Dad's prized Buick for a late-night drive to a concert in Milwaukee without permission, only to blame the mysterious dents on a family of raccoons rummaging through the trash cans, a tale I'd embellished slightly with details of the ensuing grounding that somehow evaporated after his tearful apology, drawing a few knowing chuckles and a couple of raised eyebrows in David's direction when he later launched into his own boast about selecting the perfect ring at that jeweler in the Magnificent Mile, the subtle shift in attention giving me a quiet thrill of satisfaction that evened the score without drawing blood. As the night wound down with hugs exchanged under the string lights Mom had strung between the oaks, the air cooling to that perfect summer evening chill that begged for a light sweater, I thought perhaps I'd navigated the minefield unscathed. My promotion and budding romance with Mark tucked safely away like letters in a drawer, but then I caught sight of Lisa drawing David toward the shadowed corner by the garage where the overflow trash bin sat discreetly hidden, their voices dropping to urgent murmurs that carried fragments on the breeze, phrases like, "You have to tell them soon," and "It's not the right time yet," slicing through the dispersing chatter like whispers in a confessional. My curiosity piqued to the point of compulsion as I pretended to fiddle with my keys on the patio, edging closer without alerting anyone, only for them to break apart abruptly with forced smiles when Aunt Karen called out goodbyes, leaving me to slide into my car and navigate the familiar streets homeward. The radio tuned low to a classic rock station playing Bruce Springsteen's Thunder Road, with its lyrics about escaping small-town vines resonating a little too closely. That overheard snippet gnawing at me relentlessly and hinting that the calm facade of the evening masked a deeper storm brewing just out of sight. One that might finally force the truths we'd all buried under layers of politeness to surface in ways none of us could predict. Easing my car into the driveway of my modest two-story in Berwyn that night, the porch light casting a feeble glow against the encroaching darkness, like a hesitant beacon for someone who'd just glimpsed the underbelly of their own family without fully understanding the beast. I couldn't dislodge the echo of Lisa's urgent whispers to David from my mind, those fragmented words about telling something soon twisting in my thoughts like a loose thread on a favorite sweater that threatened to unravel the whole garment if pulled too hard, and as I fumbled with the keys in the lock, the weight of the evening settled over me heavier than the humid air clinging to the suburbs, prompting a quick detour to the kitchen for a glass of tap water straight from the faucet, its coolness doing little to quench the thirst for answers that had built up over years of David's unchallenged spotlight. Sleep came fitfully that night, interrupted by dreams blending the party's laughter with shadowy figures, exchanging secrets in the garage's gloom, and by morning, my phone was alive with messages from Aunt Karen, who lived just a few blocks over in her bungalow filled with those quirky knickknacks from estate sales. Her texts probing for juicy details about Lisa's almost revelation while I sipped coffee black and strong enough to strip paint, brewed in the old percolator Dad had given me after my divorce when he figured I needed something reliable to start my days, dodging her questions with non-committal emojis I deleted before sending because this wasn't the time to stir the pot further without knowing what simmered inside. Work pulled me into the fray soon enough, the agency's open plan office buzzing with the clack of keyboards and the murmur of brainstorming sessions for a new campaign pitching eco-friendly detergents to Midwest housewives who valued cleanliness as much as conscience. My desk piled with mock-ups and client notes that demanded focus, yet even as I led a mid-morning huddle with the junior creatives, sketching out taglines that evoked sparkling sinks and guilt-free loads, My thoughts drifted back to the attic at my parents' house, where boxes of old photos gathered dust among holiday decorations. Images of David and me as kids frozen in time with him always in the foreground, his grin wide under a baseball cap, while I lurked in the shadows holding the bat he'd just swung. A visual metaphor for our roles that extended into adulthood, where his milestones garnered headlines in the family lore, and mine faded into footnotes like the fine print on a contract nobody read. Was Lisa privy to some hidden chapter from those years, perhaps tied to the way David had dropped off the radar during his junior year at college, vanishing for a semester under the vague excuse of personal growth that Mom accepted without question while I'd pieced together rumors from mutual friends about parties too wild for the straight-arrow image he cultivated, a period that left faint scars in the form of that unopened letter I'd glimpsed once in his room, postmarked from a small town up near the Wisconsin border and addressed in a handwriting that spoke of urgency, but had been shoved into a drawer like yesterday's news. The weekend arrived with the kind of crisp autumn promise that turned the leaves along Harlem Avenue into a riot of reds and golds, drawing families out for pumpkin patch runs and cider mill visits. But for us, it meant the rehearsal dinner at that familiar Italian joint in Oak Park called Rossi's, a place with checkered tablecloths and walls papered in faded photos of old Chicago mobsters that added a touch of nostalgic grit to the proceedings. The air inside thick with the aroma of garlic bread baking fresh and simmering sauces that evoked Sunday suppers from our youth when Dad would twirl spaghetti on his fork while regaling us with tales from his days as a mechanic at the Ford plant. Mom had orchestrated the seating with her usual precision, positioning me next to Uncle Ray, whose booming laugh could drown out the waitstaff, and across from Lisa, who arrived on David's arm looking radiant in a simple sheath dress that hugged her figure without trying too hard, her curls pinned back to reveal the delicate necklace David had gifted her for the occasion, a silver chain with a pendant shaped like a tiny key that symbolized unlocking their future together, though to me it whispered of doors still closed on the past she might be pushing him to open. The appetizers arrived in waves, bruschetta topped with ripe tomatoes drizzled in balsamic that burst with summer's last gasp, and fried calamari rings crisp enough to crunch under teeth, while conversation flowed toward wedding logistics, Lisa describing their vision for a ceremony at the historic chapel in Springfield where she'd taught for years, complete with vows exchanged under stained glass windows that filtered light like prayers made visible, and David nodding along. With that salesman poise, his hand resting possessively on her knee under the tablecloth, but I caught the subtle strain in his posture. The way his shoulders tensed when Dad leaned in to ask about honeymoon plans for a beach getaway in the Keys where turquoise waters promised escape from the daily grind. My own weekend had been a blur of agency deadlines, but when Dad turned to me during a lull, his eyes twinkling under bushy brows unchanged since his union days, inquiring about how I'd spent my time away from the family fold, I let a hint of my news escape in the form of a casual remark about diving deep into career developments that involved steering bigger projects toward completion. The words chosen carefully to skirt Mom's edict, but enough to draw a curious tilt from Lisa's head and a flicker of irritation across Mom's face as she excused herself to check on the main course, her heels clicking sharply against the tiled floor like Morse code for disapproval. The real shift came with the icebreaker games Lisa had suggested to bond the wedding party. A bowl of trivia slips passed hand to hand amid the clatter of silverware and the pop of uncorked candy bottles. Questions ranging from light-hearted queries about who once dyed the family dog blue with Easter egg dye to deeper probes into our shared history. The laughter peaking when David correctly identified the culprit behind a legendary pie fight at Cousin Jenny's 13th birthday that had left the basement looking like a crime scene from a slapstick comedy, but then one slip emerged that halted the merriment cold, reading in faded ink, "What's the real story behind David's college vanishing act that semester everyone whispered about but never confronted?" And the table fell into an awkward hush, David's fork pausing midair as he mustered a chuckle about overwhelming finals and a need for breathing room, his deflection smooth, but unconvincing under the candlelight that played tricks on expressions, while Lisa's smile wavered just enough to confirm she'd heard versions of this tale before, and in my mind's eye, that attic letter resurfaced, its edges yellowed like old secrets unwilling to stay buried. A clue dropped into the evening's mix that thickened the air more than the steam rising from the platters of veal parmigiana now being served. Seizing the moment for my brand of payback, the sort that masqueraded as wit to mask the years of pent-up frustration, I waited until David rose for his toast about the unbreakable bonds of family that had brought them all together. His voice resonant with the confidence of someone who'd never truly faltered, and then I lifted my glass with a deliberate clink, interjecting seamlessly with, "To David, the master of grand entrances and even grander exits, always knowing just when to step into the light or slip away into the wings," the phrasing laced with enough humor to elicit chuckles from Uncle Ray and a few cousins who appreciated the nod to his adventurous side. But David's eyes narrowed fractionally, a storm cloud passing over his features, and Mom bolted from her seat toward the restroom with a mutter about indigestion. The satisfaction of that verbal jab coursing through me like the warmth of the wine. Sharp and fleeting, yet it left a residue of unease as I wondered if poking at these cracks would fortify my position or simply widen the fissures until the whole structure gave way. Dessert followed in the form of towering tiramisu slices dusted with cocoa that no one fully savored amid the lingering awkwardness, the creamy layers mirroring the complicated strata of our relationships. And as coffee was poured from a silver pot that had seen better decades, Mom cornered me near the bar where bottles of limoncello glowed amber under the lights. Her whisper fierce and laced with accusation about whether that little crack I'd made was an attempt to undermine the joy of the night, her words hitting like a slap from the past when she'd overlooked my straight-A report cards in favor of celebrating David's B+ in gym, forcing me to feign innocence with a shrug and a comment about keeping things lively as per family tradition, all while my infertility diagnosis from months earlier loomed unspoken in my thoughts, a private parallel to whatever shadows David carried that made Mom's protectiveness feel like a double standard etched in stone. The evening stretched thin as the group began to disperse into hugs and promises of seeing everyone at the main event, but then Lisa approached me by the coat rack where scarves and jackets hung like forgotten alibis. Her perfume a subtle floral note cutting through the restaurant's savory haze, and she murmured close enough for only me to hear that we needed to talk privately about David and an incident from well before their paths crossed. Her tone heavy with the gravity of confidences long held, but before I could draw more from her, David appeared at her elbow with a gentle tug, pulling her back into the fold with excuses about an early morning tomorrow, leaving her parting glance loaded with unspoken invitation and my pulse racing with the implications of what she might reveal next. The drive home through Oak Park's tree-lined streets alive with the rustle of falling leaves suddenly feeling charged with uncertainty, as if each turn brought me closer to a crossroads where loyalty to blood might collide head-on with the allure of finally exposing the imperfections that humanized us all. Lisa's murmured invitation lingered in my ears like the faint echo of a doorbell left unanswered during the drive back to Berwyn that crisp autumn evening. The streets of Oak Park lined with maple trees shedding their fiery leaves in swirling eddies that danced under the glow of sodium street lamps, each gust seeming to whisper possibilities about what hidden chapter from David's past she might be on the verge of unveiling. A revelation that could either topple the pedestal he'd occupied since childhood or reinforce it in ways that left me even more sidelined in our family's ongoing narrative of favoritism and unspoken hierarchies. Tossing restlessly in bed that night, the sheets tangled around me like the knots in my thoughts. I replayed the rehearsal dinner's undercurrents, the trivia slip about his college disappearance, Mom's accusatory hiss by the bar, and my own barbed toast that had drawn uneasy laughs, but planted seeds of doubt, while my mind veered inevitably to my own concealed burdens, not just the promotion that would have reshaped my professional life with its promise of autonomy over creative campaigns for brands that dotted the Midwest landscape, but the deeper ache from that sterile doctor's office visit 3 months prior where the word infertility had been delivered with clinical detachment. shattering the quiet hopes I'd harbored for a second chance at building a family after Tom's betrayal had left me navigating single life with a resilience forged from too many solo holidays and empty holiday cards. Keeping it all bottled up felt like carrying an invisible suitcase through these family events, its weight growing heavier with every forced smile, especially as Lisa's pregnancy glow in the coming months would underscore the paths diverging in our lives. Hers toward expansion, and mine toward a solitary refinement of what I'd already pieced together alone, and by Monday morning, the agency's fluorescent-lit corridors swallowed me into a whirlwind of deadlines where pitching seasonal ads for holiday sales at department stores demanded every ounce of focus. Yet, even as I collaborated with the design team on visuals evoking cozy fireplaces and gift-wrapped joys that masked the loneliness of the season, my phone vibrated intermittently with family group texts coordinating final wedding details like floral arrangements of white roses and hydrangeas symbolizing new beginnings, messages that skimmed over the tensions but couldn't erase the curiosity gnawing at me about that upstate letter and whatever affair or indiscretion it might represent in David's polished history. The days blurred into a rhythm of conference calls and coffee runs to the corner deli where the barista knew my order for a large Americano with a splash of almond milk, but the anticipation built toward the engagement dinner proper. Set for Wednesday in the familiar confines of my parents' dining room that had hosted countless milestones from Thanksgiving feasts to graduation celebrations, the space transformed that evening with crisp white linens draped over the oak table that Dad had refinished himself during one of his retirement projects, and vases of fresh lilies perfuming the air with their sweet, almost cloying scent that mingled with the rich aroma of Mom's pot roast braising slowly in the oven, a recipe handed down from her own mother that involved root vegetables caramelized to perfection and a gravy thick enough to coat every bite with comfort. David and Lisa arrived fashionably on time, a matched set in coordinated outfits of navy slacks and a floral blouse for her that complemented the ring's sparkle, settling at the head of the table with the ease of people who belonged there unequivocally. While I took my assigned spot midway down, flanked by Dad's affable storytelling about union negotiations from his plant days and Aunt Karen's latest neighborhood gossip involving a neighbor's runaway tabby cat that had sparked a block-wide search party complete with flyers and flashlight vigils, the chatter flowing lightly over appetizers of deviled eggs stuffed with paprika-dusted yolks and crusty bread slices slathered in herb butter that evoked the Italian influences from our Oak Park roots. Toasts began early in the meal, Uncle Ray raising his glass with a rambling ode to enduring love that drew chuckles for its tangents into his own 40-year marriage, marked by fishing trips and shared tax seasons, followed by Mom's emotional tribute to her son finding his perfect counterpart in Lisa, her voice wavering as she recounted imagined futures of grandchildren playing in the very yard where David had learned to ride his first two-wheeler, the words landing like subtle barbs against my childless reality that I swallowed down with a sip of the Cabernet she'd uncorked from the cellar rack Dad maintained with religious care. My promotion papers burned a hole in my purse slung over the chair back, the official letter from the agency head detailing responsibilities that included mentoring new hires and shaping brand strategies for regional markets, a milestone I'd earned through sleepless nights and innovative pitches that had finally tipped the scales. But Mom's initial command echoed too loudly to risk sharing, so I nodded through the praise directed David's way, feeling the familiar squeeze of resentment when Dad asked casually about my recent projects, prompting a vague response about team collaborations on upcoming launches that skirted the truth without fully concealing the pride swelling beneath. The turning point arrived when Lisa began circulating printed engagement photos in elegant frames, glossy images capturing their joy against backdrops of Lake Michigan sunsets and urban parks where couples strolled hand in hand. But one frame held a surprise. An older snapshot slipped into the matting, showing a younger David in a college dorm room cluttered with textbooks and pizza boxes, his arm draped around an unfamiliar woman with laughing eyes, and in the blurred background, the edge of that telltale envelope postmarked from the upstate town, its handwriting a ghostly reminder of secrets long ignored. Lisa commenting breezily that it was a family heirloom unearthed during packing for their move. But the casual explanation did little to dispel the darting glances and David's sudden cough into his napkin, the air thickening with unspoken questions as the main course of tender beef slices arrived alongside mashed potatoes whipped creamy with butter and green beans snapped fresh from the garden. My revenge unfolded organically during the lull after plates were served, having texted cousin Mike earlier that afternoon with an anonymous nudge disguised as nostalgic fun about David's so-called wild college escapades, framing it as the kind of harmless lore that spiced up toasts. And sure enough, as David stood to deliver his heartfelt thanks for the evening's warmth and the family's unwavering support through life's twists, Mike interjected with feigned innocence about that legendary road trip during sophomore year when David had abandoned the group for a spontaneous rendezvous with a mystery date, leaving them stranded at a dingy motel off I-90 without a car or cell service, the table erupting into a mix of laughter and mock outrage that flushed David's cheeks to the color of the wine, his protestations drowned out by the good-natured ribbing that circled back to tales of youthful folly, and I savored the moment from my seat, the wine's warmth amplifying the petty triumph of seeing his halo dented just a fraction. A clever payback that even the ledger without overt malice yet delivered the sting of exposure he'd so often evaded. But the satisfaction soured swiftly when Mom's eyes locked onto mine across the candlelit table, her expression a storm of accusation that prompted her to draw me aside during the cheese course of sharp cheddar wedges and artisanal crackers, whispering fiercely in the pantry alcove amid shelves of canned goods from summer's harvest that my subtle machinations were poisoning the well of what should be unadulterated celebration. Her defense of David laced with reminders of how he'd always been the one to rally during crises like Dad's bypass surgery when I'd been too buried in work to drop everything, forcing me to murmur apologies through gritted teeth while defending the instinct to inject some reality into the myth, making, all the while, my infertility weighing heavier as a mirror to his concealed chapters, a dilemma that made me question whether unleashing more truths would liberate or merely isolate me further in this web of loyalties. As coffee steamed in china cups inherited from Grandma's collection, its bitter notes cutting through the dessert pies of apple and pecan baked with lattice crusts that flaked at the touch, the evening's conflicts layered like the fillings, with Dad attempting to mediate by steering talk to neutral ground like the Bears' upcoming season prospects and Lisa offering me sympathetic glances that hinted at her own navigations of family minefields. But then as plates were cleared by a reluctant cousin Jenny drafted into dish duty, Lisa rose once more from her seat at the table's head, the room falling into that expectant quiet reminiscent of the backyard hush, her voice measured as she announced the need to complete the thought she'd begun earlier, glancing at David who nodded with a tightness around his jaw that spoke volumes, but before the words could fully form on her lips, my phone buzzed insistently in my purse with a message from Mark checking in about our planned weekend hike through the Morton Arboretum's winding trails where autumn foliage promised a canopy of color. The innocent interruption cracking my composure and stirring the temptation to counter with my own disclosures right there amid the lilies and lamplight, leaving the atmosphere humming with suspended revelation and my heart pounding in the space between complicity and confession, the precipice of truth feeling both exhilarating and terrifying as the family's eyes turned expectantly, waiting for whatever bombshell might finally detonate the evening's fragile peace. That suspended moment in the dining room stretched taut as a violin string on the verge of snapping, with Lisa poised at the table's head under the soft glow of the chandelier that Mom had dusted meticulously for the occasion, its crystals refracting light into tiny rainbows across the white linens still scattered with crumbs from the pie crusts, every family member frozen in place, Mom's napkin clutched white-knuckled in her lap, Dad leaning forward with his fork forgotten against the plate, Uncle Ray's half-smile hovering uncertainly, and David gripping the arm of his chair as if anchoring himself against an incoming tide, while I sat midway through the lineup, my phone's buzz from Mark's text vibrating like a distant alarm that pulled at the edges of my resolve. The air thick with the mingled scents of cooling coffee and wilting lilies that now seemed to mock the fragility of the peace we'd all clung to through layers of pretense and partial truths. My own secrets churned beneath the surface like sediment stirred in a glass of river water. The promotion that represented not just financial security after years of scraping by in the agency's competitive trenches, but a validation of the creative instincts I'd honed through countless rejected pitches and late-night revisions. Coupled with the budding connection to Mark, whose thoughtful messages about trail maps and picnic spots hinted at a partnership built on mutual respect rather than obligation, and deeper still, the infertility diagnosis that had arrived like a quiet thief in that fluorescent-lit clinic, stealing away visions of a nursery filled with the laughter of little feet padding across hardwood floors. A loss I'd buried under work deadlines and casual dates to avoid the pitying glances that came with sharing such vulnerabilities in a family that celebrated arrivals more than absences. Part of me itched to interrupt Lisa's impending disclosure with my own counter-narrative, to rise and claim space in this story that had always marginalized my chapters, but the pull of curiosity held me fast, a morbid fascination with how her words might reshape the portrait of David we'd all polished to perfection over decades of holiday gatherings and milestone cards. His image as the reliable achiever now threatened by the shadows of that upstate letter and the college snapshot that had surfaced like an unwelcome guest at the feast. Lisa drew a steadying breath, her eyes locking briefly with David's in a silent exchange that spoke of rehearsals held in private moments away from prying ears, and then her voice filled the room with a clarity that cut through the hush. Beginning by acknowledging the warmth of the family's embrace into her life with David while emphasizing that his moment of commitment extended beyond their union to encompass responsibilities he'd shouldered in silence to spare everyone the complications of his earlier missteps. Murmurs stirred faintly as she reached into her small clutch purse, the leather soft and worn from daily use as a teacher corralling lesson plans and student artwork, and withdrew a framed photo, not of the college era, but of a young boy around 5 years old, his face alight with a gap-toothed grin under a oversized Chicago Bears cap tilted jauntily, the image capturing him mid-laugh on what looked like a playground swing set dusted with autumn leaves. And she placed it gently in the center of the table where the candle flames flickered shadows across its surface, explaining that this was Jake, David's son from a brief but intense relationship during his early 20s right after college graduation, a time when he'd been navigating the uncertainties of entry-level jobs in sales while the boy's mother, a fellow student from a community college upstate, had built a life around their child until tragedy struck 2 years ago in a devastating car accident on an icy interstate that claimed her life and left David stepping forward as the steady co-parent, arranging visitations every other weekend in a quiet apartment the boy called home with his aunt, covering child support from his commissions without fanfare or requests for family involvement because he feared the judgment or overwhelming expectations that might come with integrating such a profound secret into our close-knit circle, especially now as wedding plans solidified and the future beckoned with possibilities of blending families in ways that honored all the pieces. The room detonated into a cacophony of reactions, gasps rippling from Aunt Karen, who pressed a hand to her chest as if steadying her heart, Dad's eyes widening in stunned recognition beneath his salt and pepper brows, Mom's tears spilling freely down cheeks flushed with a mix of shock and maternal pride that somehow absorbed this revelation into her narrative of her son's inherent goodness, and Uncle Ray letting out a low whistle that broke the tension just enough for questions to tumble forth. Like dominoes toppling, inquiries about Jake's daily life in school up near the Dells where he'd taken up soccer with a team that practiced on fields bordered by pine forests. The logistics of David's drives up I-90 on alternate Fridays that cut into his weekend routines without complaint. And the aunt's role as primary guardian who appreciated the support but insisted on privacy until David felt ready to bridge the worlds fully. David rose then, enveloping Lisa in a hug that conveyed gratitude deeper than words, his voice thick as he murmured thanks for her courage in bringing this forward. positioning himself once more as the quiet hero who'd navigated fatherhood's demands amid a career that required constant travel to pharmaceutical conferences in cities like Atlanta and Seattle. The golden boy elevated yet again, not by diminishing his flaws, but by framing them as acts of selfless protection, a twist that clicked the puzzle pieces into place for me, the unopened letter likely a plea. From the boy's mother during turbulent times, the college vanishing act perhaps tied to early responsibilities he'd shouldered alone. And the whispers I'd overheard now making sense as Lisa's gentle prods toward transparency that aligned with her own values shaped by years teaching children from fractured homes. But the parallel struck me like a cold wave crashing over familiar shores, my infertility emerging as a mirrored silence. A private grief I'd concealed to avoid burdening the family with what they might see as my personal shortfall rather than the biological lottery we'd all lost differently, and in that instant, her announcement illuminated the costs of our collective muting, where David's hidden child became a testament to resilience, while my empty hopes lingered unnamed, fueling a final surge of revenge that bubbled up not from spite but from the raw need to claim visibility in this unfolding drama. Rising with my glass, still half full of the Cabernet that had warmed through the meal, I interjected into the swirling conversations with a voice steadier than I felt, proposing a toast to David and Lisa for embracing the full spectrum of life's surprises, including Jake's bright presence, and extending it to the courage of sharing truths long withheld, much like the professional leap I'd taken with a senior promotion at the agency that opened doors to leading innovative campaigns for community brands, or the genuine companionship I'd found with Mark who brought stability without the drama of past relationships, the words landing amid a blend of surprised laughter from cousins who appreciated the pivot and widened eyes from Mom whose glare softened incrementally into reluctant acknowledgement. David meeting my gaze with a nod that felt authentic for the first time, stripped of his performative charm and revealing a flicker of shared vulnerability in the man who'd always seemed untouchable. As the group circled into tentative hugs amid the clearing of dessert plates pushed aside for this seismic shift, plans emerging organically for a future meetup with Jake at a neutral spot like the Lincoln Park Zoo where seals barked and carousel horses spun under summer skies, and Lisa drawing me aside near the kitchen doorway where the lingering scent of pot roast clung to the walls. She confided softly that David had intended to approach me first among the siblings, believing my own navigations through divorce and career hurdles would grant understanding to the weight of his concealed paternal role without the risk of widespread fallout. I nodded through the exchange, absorbing the layers of implication that reframed our sibling dynamic from rivalry to reluctant solidarity, but as I slipped out into the night air cool with the promise of frost on windshields, navigating the familiar route home through Berwyn's quiet residential grids where porch lights winked like knowing eyes, the ambiguity settled over me like a half-read letter left on the mantel. Pondering whether this unveiling of David's secret child forged stronger bonds through honesty or merely rearranged the fractures in our family tapestry, exposing how my revenges, witty deflections and planted stories had provided fleeting catharsis, but ultimately widened the gaps between us, leaving questions unanswered about Jake's integration or my own path toward acceptance of childlessness alongside a potential life with Mark. The drive concluding in the silence of my driveway where stars pierced the suburban sky, inviting reflection on the enduring dance between loyalty and the liberating ache of unspoken truths that might heal in time or echo indefinitely in the quiet spaces we all inhabit.